So in our last segment, we started talking about containers and some of the services, the reasons that folks are looking at containers as a technology that they want to deploy. We started talking a little bit about OpenStack running on top of containers even. But when you start talking or thinking about OpenStack running your container as a service option, which again is sort of the initial driver, the reason people started thinking about containers and OpenStack, saying I'm going to extend my infrastructure as a service offerings to support container as a service as well. The question starts to come up of how am I going to do this? Let's make an assumption, just to put a baseline in place, that we have a running OpenStack environment. And from that environment, we want to extend our infrastructure as a service, providing virtual machines, to also provide containers in effectively the same light. So I'd like to have an API so that I can ask for a container management solution to be deployed. And this would be something like Kubernetes, Docker Swarm. You could actually deploy CoreOS instances, so you could deploy CoreOS VMs, which are effectively a container-based operating system sort of an environment. You could deploy any of these sorts of services and just make the end result container available to your tenants. That's one approach. So then the tenants would just use the Docker Swarm or Docker APIs, for example, if they're using Swarm, or talk to Kubernetes as long as you give them the Kubernetes endpoint. And in that model, the end users don't really see any difference. They don't necessarily even think about the fact that there's an OpenStack environment there. They just see containers and they use the containers. There's another model which is brought forward in the OpenStack community through tools like the Magnum project or Murano, or even heat templates for that matter, that basically say, well, what if every individual tenant or environment wanted to actually run their own container management solution, so run their own container as a service. That's certainly another approach. It's not yet clear if anyone is the right approach, and one of the nice things about OpenStack is that you have choices. You can say, well, I'd like to have some of my entities, my end users would like to actually be able to manage their own container environments. Maybe they want to use a different version of Kubernetes than the one that we would deploy as a standard, or they want to use Docker and we've decided to go with Kubernetes or Mesosphere DCOS or what have you. Certainly being able to provide that flexibility is a benefit of using another API-driven service to implement containers. So that way you can actually provide some consistency, you can provide some effectively policy in terms of that deployment process. Actually, that's one of the areas where Murano as a project is nice, because it basically has focused on the app catalog model. I can give you the LAMP stack or the main stack service or whatever service it is that you actually want to provide as a service to your entities, including, well, let me provide you Kubernetes as a service or as a solution that you can then implement at your own level of scale as you need it for your application. These are the sorts of capabilities that start to come together. So we see that there are models where you actually get OpenStack running on top of containers. So you'd potentially deploy a container as a service or a container service, not necessarily something that would be consumed by others. It's just going to be your infrastructure. Deploy OpenStack on top of that. That's approach one. You get the container lifecycle in doing that. So OpenStack now becomes a containerized application. Again, the Cola project is helping make that happen. Then you have the other version of that, which is tools like Heat or Murano or Magnum that are basically saying, well, why don't we provide APIs to turn on containers or container management tools, not so much the individual container services, but the containers or the container management environment as a service. And then lastly, there's the concept of, well, I can take my OpenStack environment and spin up a number of CoreOS instances and then just provide a Kubernetes on top of CoreOS as a service. Here's the CoreOS or the Kubernetes endpoint. So now my users can just talk to Kubernetes, schedule their resources against the pool that I have allocated as the ops manager basically for my container solution. So we have these different models for how we can actually implement this. In the next segment, we'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that still have to be addressed to really make this truly operationally ready for prime time effectively.